So let's go ahead. Our next author tonight is Don Sevetson. Don is a retired minister of the United Church of Christ, having served in Indiana, New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Oregon, Idaho, Connecticut, and Hawaii. The great-grandson of Swedish immigrants, he grew up in the Chicago area. During his years in the church, he traveled to Japan and Puerto Rico. In Havana, in 1985, he was part of a group that had a 3-hour meeting with Fidel Castro. A few years before his 1997 retirement, Don became aware of a collection of letters that Congregational missionary and co-founder of Pacific University, George Atkinson, had sent to his sponsors during 40 years. That's between 1848 and 89 in Oregon. Attracted by both the breadth of their subject matter and the clarity of writing, Don decided that Atkinson would be his retirement project. Research on the book has included travel to New Orleans and 2 Newberries, one in Massachusetts and one in Vermont, plus hundreds of hours reading microfilm. His article, George Atkinson, Harvey Scott, and the Portland High School Controversy of 1980, was published in 2007 in the Oregon Historical Quarterly.
Correction, 1880.
1880.
1880.
Mm-hmm. The High School Controversy of 1880, okay? Okay, but it was still published in 2007, right? Okay, good. In the Oregon Historical Quarterly, Atkinson, Pioneer Oregon Educator, the book he will discuss, was published 2 years ago. Last May, Don and Mary Louise were guests of honor at the gathering in Portland of 30 descendants of George and Nancy Atkinson, and were declared honorary members of the family. Cool. Don, come on up.
What a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody who makes all the efforts to get this to happen once a month. It's new to us, but we just had a great meal, and we're also enjoying the community with authors and people interested in books. I do need to add 3 quick things, one of which is just sort of, I keep hearing about librarians and so forth, people who love libraries. When our older daughter was in kindergarten, she was taken to the library by the kindergarten teacher, and on parent night, she took us aside and said they went to the library, in school library, and 3 of the boys were running all around and misbehaving, and our daughter said, "They aren't being very librarious, are they?" Add that word to your vocabulary. And then to our author, Bob Tabb, I found myself thinking about my favorite writer from the mid-century, James Thurber, who wrote a lot of personal reflections as well as fables and all sorts of interesting things. And part of his childhood stuff, he would imagine things based on what he'd heard. He was taken completely off guard by hearing about the man who left town under a cloud. He has all these kind of things, just what you were talking about, and you really find a lot of Thurber's reflections on his childhood, I think. The other thing I didn't play 180 holes of golf in one day, but when I was a teenager, I did caddy 45 holes one day, double. Paid $7.80. Well, born in Massachusetts in 1819 and moved with his family 10 years later to Vermont, George Atkinson graduated from Dartmouth and from Andover Seminary. He was married to Nancy Bates in 1846. And they sailed from Boston in October 1847, landed in Honolulu the next February, sailed for Oregon in May, arriving 3 weeks later. They lived here 40 years, first in Oregon City, and then in 1863 they moved to Portland. 3 months after arriving, he chaired the meeting at which the Board of Trustees was organized for Tualatin Academy, which soon became Pacific University. He was secretary of that board for the rest of his life. Not always to the happiness of college presidents, I might add. Always serving as a minister, missionary. He also spent 6 years as school superintendent of Multnomah County, as well as being a trustee at 4 other secondary schools and 1 college, Whitman. When I began my study of George Atkinson, I thought that his main significance was as a missionary, and his efforts for public education were sort of an adjunct to that role. I was well aware from my church history that Protestant Reformation had stressed placing the Bible in the hands of the laity, and that meant teaching people to read. And so I assumed that that's what motivated him to be interested in education. What I found was quite different. George Atkinson was a 7th generation New Englander. His ancestor, John Atkinson, built a house in Newbury, Massachusetts in 1665. And here I am visiting it a year ago March, being guided through the house by May Atkinson. 350 years of the same family. But as a 7th generation New Englander, he had been taught that the church and the school are the engines that make the whole community moral and prosperous. He saw that schools had economic, social, and political importance. I concluded, as the title of my book indicates, that his primary importance really to Oregon was in the field of education. Believing universal education to be both a moral imperative and an engine of economic growth, he worked unceasingly for good schools for all children and youth. The quality and longevity of his leadership was such that the wider community came to listen to his voice with trust and respect. I also learned that his legacy of published work was notable for the range of things he both knew about and was able to discuss in detail. He became an articulate, influential voice in his adopted region. I also learned that he was forever on the move. Within Oregon and Washington, he became a familiar figure in many communities. During his 40 years in Oregon, he made 8 trips back to the east. Walking, riding a stage, sailing, taking the transcontinental railroads as soon as they were available. The travel record is amazing. He touched the White House, Alaska, New England, Illinois, Ohio, Missouri, Panama, California, Oahu, Maui, Cape Horn, and many points in between. His range of influence and interest and knowledge included mining, agriculture, railroads, meteorology, Native Americans, and every aspect of education. Children's needs, teacher training, textbooks, classroom furniture, school districting, state responsibility for education. And what I've chosen to do is to read two brief things, and then I'm going to go to a lengthy thing. As was indicated in the earlier reading, I did a lot of simply transcribing from his writings, and I've tried to make the book speak with his voice. In fact, I worked with the university press and got a couple of professional reviews that were very helpful and very positive in terms of the importance of the subject and the thoroughness of the research. But they said, we can't use all these long quotes. And I said, I can. And so I wound up working through CreateSpace, which is Amazon's self-publishing division. And so I preserved some of the longs, because I figured, you know, anybody can listen to my voice, but it's not very often you get to hear the voice of a 19th century leader. One that I want to refer to is on bullying at school. It's a current topic, right? And this is in one of his 20 superintendent's reports that he wrote in the Oregonian as superintendent of the 31 school districts in Multnomah County. School grounds are a part of the teacher's domain as much as school rooms. 2 teachers in our large schools, a gentleman and a lady, should always oversee the pupils during recess and an intermission on the playgrounds or in any basement or room appointed to recreation. In no other way can quarrels or bad words or vexatious and oppressive conduct of older and stronger pupils over the younger, weaker, and more timid ones, or immoral tendencies be checked or repressed, and the best manners and habits be cultivated. The most common evils of our schools and the chief complaints arise from the rude, wild, improper, and some reckless conduct of a few pupils during recess and intermission. Good order in the playground will secure it in the recitation room. Not totally unrelated to today's world. And then he made a lengthy visit to the Warm Springs Reservation, as well as visiting Umatilla and Yakima and Maka, which is way up the point of the Olympic Peninsula. And in one of his writings in the Oregonian, he says this: distrust of the whites and the government turns friendly Indians to foes. The duty of the hour is to redeem every pledge and win back their faith in the government. The President and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs can do this by fulfilling the treaties. Messages ought to arouse both to prompt action. Life, property, and the welfare of the frontier settlements are at stake. That's in 1882, I believe. No, 1878. Okay, now the one that I left for last here is that shortly after he left the pastorate of the church in Portland, he became the regional person for the denomination for Oregon and Washington Territory. And this is a letter that he wrote to his cousin back in Massachusetts. On the 15th of July, 1873, Tacoma was chosen as the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad on the Sound. I reached Olympia on the 16th, met a banker from Illinois who spent the previous night at Tacoma, said that drinking, gambling, shooting, and fighting began on the wharf and the only street, keeping him awake all night, that he designed to invest there, but would not move his wife to such a place. Does this sound like some of the movies we've seen? Or Hell on Wheels? I told him that this was only the first Russian phase of life in new western towns, and that order would appear, that we must meet and overcome whiskey and its attendant vices with the gospel, which is as adequate to the redemption of society as to the salvation of man. He would not be persuaded to remain, though a Christian man. I retired to my room at the hotel, thought it over, and prayed for life. Sleep departed. The idea of erecting a tent to preach in had been suggested. I resolved to put one up at the front among the saloons. Rose early and telegraphed to Portland to have one made immediately, and wrote special directions to my wife and son. Went to Tacoma the next day, found great excitement. Prices of lots up to hundreds and even thousands of dollars, and saloons and tents and sheds and going up. I gave notice that I would preach at the schoolhouse at 11 o'clock on Sabbath, July 20th. Did so to 25 or 30 hearers. Gave notice of my plan to have a tent up by next Sabbath for church services on Sabbath and a free reading room all week with Bibles, tracts, daily and weekly papers, and magazines, and took up a collection of about $30.15, Judge Rice giving $20. Very specific on his record keeping. I hired a lot at $10 per month, 25 by 60, the next morning by the side of one saloon fronting two others. Bought lumber for a platform and tables, engaged a carpenter to get both ready, returned to Portland, got my tent, papers, magazines, Bibles, hallowed songs, and got back to Tacoma on Saturday noon, put up the tent that PM and hung out the painted banner, Congregational Union Free Reading Room. Lighted the candles, set the chairs, spread out the reading matter on the tables, and soon a dozen or more were seated quietly reading or writing, paper, pen, ink, and envelopes being freely furnished. On Sabbath AM 27th, the second painted flag was hung out, preaching at 11 o'clock and evening 7 o'clock, all invited. 35 or 40 were present, and we spent a quiet hour, except as the noise from the saloon occasionally drew attention. Pastors stopped and listened to the singing. Whiskey drinkers and gamblers seemed surprised and somewhat defiant, but all treated us with respect and did not interfere. Collection was taken of $8.60, enough to assure current expenses and interest on the investment. For 2 months and more, the tent was used by myself 1 or 2 Sabbaths per month, and by Presbyterians and Methodists or others the rest of the Sabbaths. A Bible school was also kept up by from 6 to 15 men at 3 o'clock. Collection was taken. Whole expense of tents and furnishing, $187.75, collected $98.45. During our tent life, the Sabbath AM and PM service gave an air of quietness to the day. The Episcopalians built a temporary house of worship not far off, and the minister fixed up a house, started a Sabbath school and regular services, and settled down to the work. Our tent reading room became a constant resort day and evening, and strangers called it the best thing at Tacoma. We rejoiced to see young men regular visitors. Temperance and other lectures were given in it. A book with pledge was on the table and over an 80 names signed. But gamblers and saloon men plunged their arts more urgently. Sabbath Eve would witness a game of jumping in front of the saloon, or special moving of drinkers to and fro before the tent. One inebriate lay down on the tent floor and slept off his inebriation while we held our Bible school. When he awoke, we said, "You've had a good nap. No one has hurt you. You'd better go and get some coffee and food instead of whiskey." He replied, "I will give something to this church." One evening, as I stepped from the hotel to the room to read the papers, I saw a crowd and a man excitedly talking. I passed in and he stood in front cursing someone. I soon found out he meant me. W tax for the unlicensed tent. I read on, regardless of his drunken speech. When someone rebuked his impudence, his reply was a blow and a drawn pistol. A man said to me, "He is the county sheriff." I saw that a word would madden him to shoot into the crowd, and concluded to step across the street. He followed, demanding with cocked pistol the tax. I said, "We'll settle tomorrow." His friends took him away then. I saw it was the liquor seller's job to get my tent away, but they overshot the mark. Community was roused. He came and asked my pardon in the matter and said he did not know what he did, but that he had a pistol out. I gave him a good lecture. He came again and confessed his shame, gave me $10 for the reading room, and said he would not drink. He omitted whiskey for some weeks, but drank lager beer and at length resumed whiskey, and the last I heard was that he shot a prisoner while intoxicated. My hopes respecting the moral and religious results have been more than realized. Several saloons closed up and one or two more open, but a habit of observing the Sabbath was established. Good men were strengthened to close doors of shops on that day. A quiet worship was secured. A stranger said he had lived in a California town 20 years without a church or Sabbath, and he felt sure that some good men must be in Tacoma, for here were church and reading room at once. A rough man met me one day, said he knew me in Oregon, confessed himself a gambler and a rough, but said, "We know you're right," gave me $250, would not tell his name. Pious young Andover Seminary graduate who had boarded the Sevetson in Boston Harbor in October of 1847 had come a long way in its approach to home missionary work. Pitching a tent on Saloon Row, facing a drunken sheriff waving a pistol, reaching out to saloon keepers, sailors, loggers, cooperating with Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians were now within his capabilities. The first review of the book I got was from my cousin in Illinois, who's a pretty secular person. And he said, "You know, I got a feeling of what it was like to live back then. And I hope that many others will have the same experience."